right, thank you all for joining us for the Research, Thesis, Dissertation, and Scholarly Writing Workshop. Joining us today is Dr. Jennifer Pharr, Associate Professor in Environmental and Occupational Health. Dr. Pharr will help us enhance our academic writing know-how by gaining a further understanding of different kinds of scholarly writing and how to apply beneficial techniques as well as any resources our campus has to offer to support writing efforts. Without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Pharr to get us started.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for having me for this workshop. This is one of my passions, is to talk about scholarly writing, a little bit of scholarly writing humor for those of you who've ever submitted a paper for peer review to be accepted in a peer-reviewed journal. You might have kind of felt like you're running the gauntlet and you're there to try to get your paper accepted. Again, I'm an associate professor in the School of Public Health, and full disclosure, I am going to be really focusing on more scientific and technical writing in this presentation. When I'm talking about scholarly writing, I'm not going to be, and I'm not an expert in creative writing. So if you're thinking more about like a creative writing, scholarly writing, that probably will be a different workshop than what we're talking about. I'm really going to be focusing on scientific writing, technical writing, the kind of writing that we do for journal articles, for your thesis, for your dissertation. That's the type of writing that I'm going to be focusing on. There's a really great book that I use in my technical and scientific writing class titled How to Write and Publish a Scientific Paper. They're on the 8th edition now. It's a great book. It walks you step by step through the writing process. And also, I'm sort of condensing a lot of information into an hour here. I usually teach this information over an entire semester. So if you're really interested in more knowledge about that, we'll talk about at the end of this workshop about where you can get more information on campus, as well as maybe some courses. So let's just kind of get like a baseline about what is scholarly writing. Whenever we're writing, typically our purpose is to communicate our new scholarly findings. You did a study, you've done your thesis, you've done your dissertation, you're writing for a scientific paper, you've found something and you want to share those findings. So one of the key characteristics of scholarly writing is clarity. We want to be able to share our new findings in a clear enough way that people can understand what we found and they're able to replicate our study design if they so choose to. So scholarly writing should be clear, precise, and even simple if possible, especially if we're trying to communicate something that's really difficult for others to understand. It's better to write that in a more simple way than in a more technical way that just makes it more difficult for people to understand. In scholarly writing, we're writing to communicate, not necessarily to impress. So like a little bit more scholarly writing humor, this person, say a professor, is saying, no, if you make the paper too easy to read, then everyone will know exactly how we got our results. We're shooting for the opposite of that, right? We want people to be able to understand exactly what we did and exactly how we got our results. So something to think about as just we begin the scholarly writing process. So some of the tips and tricks to our scholarly writing process. First, it's important that we establish our mindset. Okay, so we want to keep in mind that writing needs to be clear and it needs to be simple. So you need to think about, why is my study important? What did I do? What did I find? And what does it mean? So that's the clear, simple mindset. And those are the questions that we need to be asking ourselves whenever we're beginning the writing process. We also need to have the mindset that the first version is never perfect. In writing, we end up revising. We write the first draft of maybe the prospectus of our thesis or our dissertation. We send it to our chair. They're going to send it back with feedback. We're going to revise and send it back to them. They're going to send it back to us with more revisions to be addressed, right? So this is going to be this back and forth process. And you need to have the mindset that, hey, this is going to happen. So when it does happen, you're not like, whoa, wait a minute. I wrote my paper. I'm done, right? No. We revise, both for thesis, dissertations, and also scholarly papers. We also are going to need to be able to receive feedback. And whenever we get feedback, we need to have the mindset that we're not going to take it personally, right? We get feedback from our chairs, from our committee members, from reviewers at the journals. We need to not take it personally, set that aside, right? We need to read through the comments, especially when we're talking about scholarly articles. Some of the reviewer comments are going to be tremendously helpful and really improve the quality of your paper. There's not a paper that I've published, and I've published over 120 peer-reviewed papers, that has not been improved by some of the comments from the reviewers. But also, in the same token, sometimes I get comments from reviewers that just are not helpful. They either didn't understand my paper, they're irrelevant. So those I need to address, but in a way of like letting them go, right? I need to say, no, I'm not going to be able to make that revision for whatever reason and justify that. So use what you can, let go of the rest. We also need to be really aware of ourselves and our writing process. So how do you write? What works best for you? What works best in terms of how, when, and where? You can see these different images. Some people work best sitting at a desk with all distractions turned off. Some people work best by writing things out. I have students always tell me that they work best as that frantic little cartoon, like hurried writing. Oh, I do my best work under pressure, Dr. Pharr. I'm going to tell you probably don't. Though people believe that they do. Some people work best in like a cafe or a coffee shop where there's other stuff going on around them. It really helps them focus in and work. Some people write best in the morning. Some people write best in the evening. Some people write best during the day. It's important that you know what works best for you so that you can utilize those times when you're at your optimum to do any of your writing. So think about that and be self-aware and know what works best for you. Whenever you start the writing process, a few more tips. You want to allocate enough time, and you want to think about time allotments. So it's better, if possible, to space out your writing. Spacing out our writing helps to prevent fatigue. I'm sure all of us have done that writing where, oh my goodness, paper is due tomorrow. I kind of put it out of my mind or forgot about it. So I'm going to sit down and write for 8 or 10 hours. You get tired and you start to get writer's block and things like that. It's better if you can space out your writing, and it prevents fatigue. Whenever you space it, you write for a bit, you walk away. Next day you come back, you can have those aha moments in the gaps between your writing. So when I was working on my dissertation, I would go do spin classes, and I would have aha moments in the middle of a spin class. Oh yes, that's how I'm going to write that part of my discussion or my results section. You also, whenever you come back to your paper, you can approach it with a fresh set of eyes, so you can kind of read it the way a reader does. Sometimes when you reread your writing from the day before, it's like, oh my goodness, that doesn't make sense, right? And so you can rewrite it and improve it. So it's better if you can write an hour per day for 5 days than to try to write for 5 hours in one session, okay? Also, whenever you want to get started with the writing process, it's important to be self-aware and know what works best for you. So a few things you can do: brainstorming. So we've all done brainstorming in groups, right, at meetings and things where you write ideas down, maybe on sticky notes, on a piece of paper. Doesn't need to be a complete sentence. You just write down every thought you have. There's no wrong thought to begin with. Then once you end your brainstorming session, then you can go through and look at everything and say, okay, this is good, this is good. We'll throw that away. This is good, this is good. Okay. That's one way that people get started with the writing process. Other people talking it out may be a good way to get started with the writing process. So if you have a friend, go for a walk and, okay, hey, I'm thinking about, writing a paper about this. And then they may say, oh, well, that's interesting. Tell me more about it, right? And it starts to generate those ideas for writing. The thing that I do for my writing process is more free writing. So free writing is similar to brainstorming. You write without trying to make everything perfect. You just write, but you write in complete sentences, okay? But you don't fill in all the gaps. You don't pause to fill in all the information. So I have done a lot of research in HIV prevention, HIV testing, So I know that there are 36, 37 million people in the world with HIV. When I'm free writing, I don't need to stop and go look up that exact number. I might put there are XX million people living with HIV, and then put on the end of my sentence cite. So I know I need to go back and cite that. I need to go back to the World Health Organization and then cite that. But I don't stop my free writing to go look up those specific pieces of information. I just write, let things flow, and then at the end of my free writing session, I go and look up and fill in those blank spaces. So again, be self-aware, know what works best for you as far as generating ideas. Is it brainstorming or talking or free writing? Know what works best for you as far as the time of day, where, when, all those sort of things that you're going to do your writing, and try to space out the times that you spend writing. In my technical writing class, I've taught it for 6 or 7 years now, and I really wanted to give students and also myself sort of a way of visualizing a scholarly paper. So I came up with this anatomy of a scholarly paper. Scholarly paper, we can fill that in with, it could be the anatomy of a thesis, the anatomy of a dissertation, the anatomy of a peer review publication. All of these have the same general overall anatomy, just some will be longer and each section will be bigger. A dissertation would be the longest, right? The introduction would be longer, the results section would be longer, the discussion would be longer. Scientific paper would be shorter. Most of journals in the sort of scientific area, they have a word limit of anywhere from 1,500 to 5,000 words. Okay, your dissertation might be 150, 200 pages, right? So it's going to be much longer, but it's the same general anatomy. So the anatomy of a scholarly paper, start with the introduction. The opening, the beginning of your introduction should be the big opening statement. Why is your study important? Okay. And your introduction, we're going to talk about each of these sections specifically in a moment. Then your introduction narrows down. It gets more specific and more specific and more specific to the purpose of your study. So what is the purpose of your study? What is the goal of your study? Okay, that's where your purpose statement is, and that's usually where the introduction ends, is with the purpose statement. Then from the introduction, we move to the method section. The method section, you're telling the reader exactly how you did your study. And again, we'll go through the different sections of a method section in just a moment. After your methods comes the results. What did you find? And then after the results comes the discussion. So what do your findings that you presented in the results, what do those findings mean? And the discussion is like a right side up triangle instead of the upside down triangle in the introduction. So you start with talking about what were the most important of your findings? What do these findings mean? Again, we'll talk more about the discussion, but then your discussion gets more broad as you go down through the discussion, and you close with your big closing statement. What did we learn from this study? Okay, and we'll go through each of these separately. Most likely, if you're thinking about like your thesis or dissertation, you might kind of flow through the anatomy of a scholarly paper just as it is, right? You're going to start writing your introduction, your background, and methods. You'll present that part of your dissertation or thesis as your perspectives. Then once you get your committee's approval, then you're going to do your study, then you'll have your results and discussion. But don't feel like you always have to follow the anatomy exactly as it is, right? Oh, I have to write that big opening statement first, and then I go through my introduction. If you're writing a scholarly paper, and I often do things this way, once I know the purpose, my research question, the purpose of my study, I might be then working on my methods. And if I'm in the middle of doing my study, recruiting my participants or getting the survey sent out or something like that, I could be writing that part of my paper. I don't have to wait till my study is completely finished to write the method section. If I'm analyzing the data, I can start writing the results section. I don't have to wait until the end of my study and write the introduction to methods first before I can write anything about my results. So you can start anywhere on this anatomy of a scholarly paper. and start writing and get momentum. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So let's talk a little bit about the introduction part of the paper. Again, you're going to start broad and you're going to narrow down to the purpose of your study. In the introduction section, and whenever you're writing a thesis or a dissertation, usually you have your introduction chapter and then a background chapter where you really dive into the background information about your topic. But in your background section, in your introduction section, you want to provide sufficient background information so that the reader can evaluate your study and the importance of your study. So you want to provide a rationale for conducting your study. So why did you choose this topic? Why is your topic important? And again, you start broad and you narrow down to the purpose or the objective of your study. So let's look at this in a little bit more zoomed in fashion. So the big opening statement typically is general, and it sets the magnitude or the importance of your problem. So again, I've said I've done a lot of work in HIV and HIV prevention. So say the purpose of my study, I'm going to be a study looking at barriers to HIV testing among adolescents in Clark County. Okay, that's going to be the purpose way down at the end of the triangle for me. Okay, so my big opening statement needs to be something that makes the reader say, whoa, okay, this is really important. So my big opening statement might be 37 million people in the world are infected with HIV. Okay, that's a lot of people, right? That makes it really important. Then the next section of the introduction, if it's a scholarly paper, it might be the next paragraph. If it's a thesis or a dissertation, it might be the next actually big section of your thesis or dissertation, is more specific to the purpose of your study. So maybe it sets the magnitude of the problem within your setting. Okay. Then the next section is even more specific to the purpose. This is more like the background section. What do we already know about this topic? Okay. So I said that 37 million people in the world are infected with HIV, with people between ages of 18 and 24 being the group with the greatest number of new HIV infections, and also the lowest percent of people being tested for HIV. Okay. And then in Clark County, move down to the importance of this issue in Clark County. Okay. So more specific to the purpose. And then also in the background, we want to tell the reader what are the gaps, right? So your thesis or your dissertation, you're trying to fill a gap in our knowledge. You're trying to do a study that's never been done before. So we know all of this information. Again, if I'm doing my study, we know all this information about barriers to HIV testing among adolescents around the world, internationally, in the United States, but we don't know it in Clark County. And Clark County has unique special issues. So that's where the gap is, and I need to let the reader know about that. So once I've told them what we know, where the gap is, then this is the gap that my paper is going to fill, that my study is going to fill, which is the purpose of your paper. If you're thinking about a scholarly article, usually the introduction is about 4 to 5 paragraphs long. If we're thinking about a thesis or a dissertation, it may be 4 or 5 sections long. Okay, so and sections being many, many paragraphs and many pages. The introduction, the goal or the purpose of your study, typically it's to fill a gap in knowledge. Okay, we've taken the knowledge to here, and then this is the next piece of knowledge that we need to get a better understanding of this whole phenomenon. Maybe you're going to test or compare procedures. We've always studied or measured something this way, and now we're going to try measuring it this way. Maybe you developed a new method. Maybe you've developed a new statistical method to analyze something. Maybe you're doing a review of the literature. Maybe you're doing a scoping or a systematic review. That's the purpose of your study. Or oftentimes in scholarly writing, we're testing a hypothesis or answering a question. The introduction part of your paper can be subdivided into sections, with each section having a heading. That's sort of maybe optional in a scientific paper, but a must when you're thinking about your thesis or your dissertation. that you're going to have different subsections within your introduction. Again, we want to conclude the introduction with the purpose or the goal of our study. And by ending our introduction, we funnel down to that purpose. Then it leads the reader right into the next section, which is going to be the materials and methods section. The materials and methods section needs to be a complete description of all the methods that were used in your study. Again, we want the person reading our study, if they wanted to duplicate our study, to be able to read our methods and then duplicate our study. So maybe we do our thesis studying Lake Mead here in Las Vegas, and they want to go do the same methodology but in one of the Great Lakes, right? They should be able to see exactly what we did here and go do the same study in the Great Lakes. Or maybe we do our study now and someone wants to repeat it 5 or 10 years in the future to see if they're getting the same results. They need to be able to do exactly what we did in our study. Materials and methods sections are written in the past tense. Even if you just did it and you're just writing that down, it's done, it's completed, so it's written in the past tense. We want to describe the procedures that were performed and under what condition those were performed. And whenever I'm writing a method section, I try to think about like sort of like a recipe, right? Recipe tells you, first you do this, then you do this, then you do this, and then you do that, right? It's in a chronological order, and that's how you want to write out your methods section. Some of the subsections in a methods section, generally we separate it into these subsections if it makes sense. For some maybe studies it doesn't make sense, but things to think about as far as sections of your method section, again, whether it's a scientific paper, a thesis, or a dissertation. What was your experimental design? Was it a clinical trial? Was it a cohort study? Was it observational? Was it qualitative, focus group? What was it? What was your experimental design? What was the setting and the time period of your data collection? So where and when did you collect your data? Who or what was your sample or population? What instruments or surveys did you use? How were the data collected, or what were the data sources? What variables did you collect? And then ending the method section with the data analysis, because tell the reader how you analyzed your data, and then from there you can move right into your results. So this is how you analyze it, and this is what you found. So a little bit more specific to some of those different sections of the method section. So the setting or the data collection. So where were the data collected, or where was the study conducted? You want to be specific about the location. So did you collect data here in Clark County, Nevada? Did you collect data across the United States? Did you collect data across multiple countries? Like where did your samples come from? You want to be specific. So in your methods section, don't be afraid to include things like a map. So if in public health, we go out and collect samples like out at Lake Mead. So I might want to include in my methods section a map of Lake Mead, and hey, here are the places where I collected the samples. Again, so that way if someone wants to go back out to Lake Mead 5 years from now, they know exactly where to go collect the samples if they want to replicate the study. So don't be afraid to include graphics in your methods section. You want to talk about when you collected your data, and details depend on the reason for when the data were collected. So did you collect your data during a specific season? So if I'm collecting pollen, maybe I'm collecting it during the spring, right? Because that's when pollen is the highest. If I'm collecting data about the flu, maybe I collect it every winter on a every winter basis. Maybe I collect my data at a certain time of day, or certain, like in the morning time is when something is the highest, so I collected it during the morning. Maybe we just have come through COVID. Maybe we collected data from participants during COVID because we wanted to know how COVID was affecting mental health or exercise or academic performance or whatever, right? So we want to be specific about when we collected our data. We want to also provide information about how we collected our data. And in this part of the methods section, it's important to provide details, get enough details that someone can read your thesis, your dissertation, or your academic paper and go out and repeat your study. So who were the participants? How were they recruited? What were the inclusion and exclusion criteria? Or if you're collecting samples, how did you collect those samples? What did you collect them all at once? Did you collect them, at staggered intervals or things like that? You want to include all of that into your methods section. Under how your data were collected, you also want to give specific information about instrumentation or surveys or questionnaires or procedures that you use in collecting your data. So if you're using instruments, say like you're, again, collecting samples of something, you want to list the name of each instrument and the model number. So again, if someone's replicating your study, can they get the same instrument, the same model number? Include information about the manufacturer. If you're using a questionnaire, a validated questionnaire, so a questionnaire that someone else created and they validated, you want to provide information about that, right? Information about the survey or the questionnaire's validity and reliability and who did that, and reference them and cite them. Or if you're creating your own survey. Sometimes, as much as we try to find one, there's not a validated questionnaire that asks the questions that we need to ask for our study. So if you developed your own survey, you need to provide information about how you developed it, how you tested it, how you checked its validity, right? You want to provide that sort of information in the methods section. And then the method section, you conclude the method section with the statistical analysis. So in your statistical analysis section, you want to indicate what software did you use? Did you use SPS, R, SAS, in vivo? What did you use? You want to identify what your different variables were. So what was your independent variable or variables? What were your independent variables? And you want to describe the statistics you used for your analysis. So did you do t-test? Did you do linear regression, multiple linear regression? What did you use? So all of that information is going to be included in your method section. So you present your statistical analysis plan, and then from there you move into your results section. Your introduction and your methods tell the reader why you did your study and how you got your results. Your discussion section tells the reader what your results mean. Your results section tells the readers what you found, and it is the most important part of your paper. It is the new knowledge that you are providing to the world from the study that you have completed. So the results are written in the past tense, and even if you just finish your statistical analysis and you're writing your results right then, it's in the past, so it's written in the past tense. In your results section, you want to present relevant data, representative relevant data. You don't need to present repetitive data, okay? So the compulsion to include everything, leaving nothing out, does not prove that one has unlimited information. It proves that one lacks discrimination or the ability to discern what is important and what is not important. So your results section, again, is going to be written short, and it's going to, instead of the cartoon character on the left whose eyes are like, oh, is overwhelmed with all of the results coming at them, you want to be very conscious about how you present your results. So you're going to have some text that may be a figure, then some text that may be a table, okay, so that the reader can say, okay, these are the important findings, and then over here in the table, there are all the other findings that aren't important to talk about every single finding in text, right? Maybe you only talk about the significant findings in the text. Refer the reader to the table for the rest of the findings. But you don't want to include every single thing in text. That would be overwhelming to the reader. So how do you decide? Do you present the findings all in text? Do you put it into a table or into a graphic? Well, if you only have a few results to provide, then you might just want to present them in text format. So for example, if you're just doing a simple linear regression, there's no need to put that into a table because it's very easy to put that into text format. Here's an example of that on the slide. So just a simple linear regression. But if you're doing more than a simple linear regression, maybe you're doing logistic regression and calculating odds ratios, or maybe you're doing multiple linear regression and you have several independent variables, or you're doing chi-square tests, but you have several different categories, right? You'd want to present that information as either a table or a graph. Because if you try to write out all of the information that's in this table on this slide, it would be pages and pages and pages worth of text, and the reader would just get lost in that. They wouldn't be able to discern what is important or what is significant, what you really want them to take away from your paper. So I just want to kind of take a step to the side and talk about the advantage of graphics right now. So you may have heard the saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, in scholarly writing, a picture literally could be worth 1,000 words. Like, you could present something in a table or in a figure that cuts 1,000 words out of the text if you were trying to write everything out in text. Tables and figures are more interesting to look at for the reader than text. It's easier to present data in a table than it is written out in text format, especially if you have large amounts of data, again, like the table on the previous slide. Both figures and tables attract the attention of a reader, and it kind of gives the reader's eye a chance to just take a break. You know, if you're reading text, and then you see a table, you're reading text, and then you see a figure. It just kind of gives your eyes a break, and your brain can process the information a little bit differently. Whenever you're using graphics, say like a bar graph or a pie chart or something like that, you can really enforce emphasis. Like, if you really want to say, hey, I want you to look at this part of the bar graph because it's really important. This is really big and different than all the other bars on the graph. You can put that in red and really draw their attention. Requires less space, so it's more efficient. And tables are also critical for numerical or statistical information. Again, like, if I want to present my information and I really want the reader to look at the p-values, I can have p and then the column going down, and that can just is critical that they can see, okay, this is significant to 0.0001 or something like that, right? You can get that sort of information across in a table versus trying to write all that out in text. So when do we use a table and when do we use a figure? Well, tables are great for if we need to provide a list of numbers, especially if we need the reader to be able to see like a specific number, like 3.59. Okay, it's much easier to show that in a table than versus a figure. Like, if I was going to do a bar graph and I wanted the person to know that it's 3.59, it's like, well, okay, where does that bar end? And trying to look across to the axes, it's easier just to put that sort of specific information into a table. If you need a listed, like labels in a column, is good. That tables are good for that as well. However, tables do not show trends or relationships. So if you're trying to show trends and relationships, you would be better off using a figure. So figures are really good for showing trends or relationships, a good visual presentation of the results. Or if you want to compare results, like if you do X intervention, you get Y outcome, and if you do Z intervention, you get Y outcome, right? And you can see, well, X intervention was much better. You got much better outcome than Y intervention. But again, figures are not good if you want people to see very precise numbers. So looking at this example of a figure, so it's more that in this example, we just wanted you to see the bar graph was greater on top, and then things got less as we went down the bar graph. You don't need to know exactly that specific number. That's not that important. But then on the bottom, if you really want people to focus on the p-value or the odds ratio, and like, I want you to see that this is 1.27 odds, right? Then that information is better presented in a table. Okay, let's go back to talking about the results section. So typically the results are short and sweet without a lot of verbiage or explanation. That's the most important part of your thesis, your dissertation, your scholarly paper. It's often the shortest of all of those things, especially if You have a really well-written methods. So you're telling the reader, hey, this is exactly how we did our study. And then if your results section precedes a really well-written discussion, then it can be pretty short. Hey, this is what we found. Crystal clear and simply stated, this is what we found. So your results is, again, the new knowledge you're presenting to the world. So it's really, again, the most important part of your paper. In the results section, a few things you want to avoid. You want to avoid being redundant. So you don't want to put into Word things that are apparent on your tables or your graphs. You certainly, even worse would be putting everything into words that is in your tables and graphs. Why have the tables and graphs if you're putting everything into the text? What you do want to do is to state the most important finding and then refer your reader to the table or to the figure. Okay, here are the 2 significant variables out of 20. Now go look at the table for all the other information, all the variables that weren't significant and all of that. In the results section, we are presenting the results, but we're not interpreting our findings, right? The interpretation of the findings, we say that for the discussion section. Typically, the results section we put in a logical order of how we analyze the data. Oftentimes we use subsections. And you think about, well, how did I do my statistical analysis? How did I say I was going to do it? That's probably how you're going to present the findings, right? So you might start with characteristics of the sample or characteristics of population, descriptive characteristics. Then then from there you moved into your simple statistical analysis, like just your linear regression or logistic regression. And then from there you do a more complex data analysis. So maybe you do multiple linear regression or multiple logistic regression. So you would have it in that order and have subsections in that order. So again, in your results section, you want to lead or refer the reader to the graphics. You want to provide a framework for the reader to understand the graphic. We wouldn't want to put a table or a figure in the results section, never say anything about it. Now we want to say maybe the statistical important findings are X, Y, and Z, and then refer them to table 1 to see X, Y, and Z as well as all of the other variables that you included in your analysis. Typically, especially for dissertation or thesis, now for a scholarly paper, the journal may have a specific place where they want you to place your graphics, your tables and figures. But for your thesis and your dissertation, you're going to put the graphic immediately after you refer to that graphic for the first time in the text part of your paper. So maybe talk about the important findings from the important information from your descriptive characteristics, and then you put your table about your descriptive characteristics underneath that paragraph. And then you talk about your simple regression, and then you put the table referring to that underneath that paragraph. So you put them right after, you put your figures right after you talk about them in the text. All right, let's talk a little bit about the discussion and introduction and how those 2 things work together. So from the anatomy of a scholarly paper, the introduction was the upside down triangle. Start with that big opening statement, why is your study important, and you funnel down to the purpose of your paper. And then your discussion is just the opposite of that, right? What were the most important findings from your paper, and then ends with the big closing statement, what did we learn from this study? A way to think about the discussion and the introduction is they work like a pair. So the introduction poses a question. What was your research question? And then your discussion answers the question posed in your introduction. It's important that whenever you're thinking about writing a discussion, that you don't want to include anything in the discussion that you haven't at least mentioned in the introduction. And I know the way that typically we do like a thesis or a dissertation, hey, we start with the introduction and then we work our way down to the discussion. And so if you're writing the discussion last, you might have to go back up and include something in the introduction. But you don't want the reader to be sort of thrown off by like, okay, the introduction, I get it. But then I got down to your discussion and you're talking about something. This is the first time I've seen it in your paper. So I'm confused by that. You don't have to go into great detail necessarily in the introduction, but you want to think about at least mentioning it in the introduction so that the reader's not sort of caught off guard whenever they read that information in your discussion. The discussion is the hardest part of a paper to write. My students struggle most with the discussion section of their thesis or their dissertation because typically you've never written a discussion section until you write a thesis or a dissertation. I know when I write a paper, often it's like, okay, gotta sort of psych myself up for writing the discussion question because it's okay, this is what I found, but what does it mean? What are the implications or the applications of my findings, right? So that takes a little bit, I think, more brain work, in my opinion, to write the discussion. The discussion is a harder section to define than maybe the method section or the results section. It is often rushed. So you all know that in doing your thesis or your dissertation, there's a time frame that you have to have that completed. So, your completed thesis or dissertation has to go to the graduate college by a certain date. So that means you have to defend by a certain date. It means you have to have it to your committee 2 weeks before the date that you defend. So, it's like you back it up. And a lot of times it's like, oh my goodness, I, maybe spent months or semesters writing my introduction and background, and I have like a few days or a few weeks to write my discussion, right? So it's often rushed. It's often a repetition or repetitive of the results. In your discussion, you want to, again, highlight the significant or the important findings, but it's not a repeat of the result sections. So maybe, okay, this is one of the significant we found. You don't need to include the p-value or the F or the T or anything like that. Just a significant barrier to HIV testing was stigma, and then go on from there. You don't have to, again, go way into the results section. Oftentimes, discussion sections are too long and too verbose. So in thinking about writing your discussion section, there are two kind of different approaches you can take. Either approach number one, you can reacquaint the reader with the reason for your study and remind them of the gap in the literature, and then start with, okay, here's the most important finding of the study. I think for a thesis or a dissertation, that might be the best way to go because theses and dissertations are so long, you might need to, hey, remember, this is why we're doing the study and here's the gap that we're filling. Okay, now here's what we're finding. Or you can just begin your discussion with the most important finding of the study, the most interesting finding of the study, and go from there. So for your discussion section, you want to, again, briefly restate the important findings. Don't include the P and all that sort of information. Just this was a significant finding, and then talk about it. Discuss how that significant finding relates to finding from previous research. Does it support findings from previous research? Is it different from findings from previous research? You can use previous research to help explain your findings. Well, why did you find what you find? Why did we find that COVID-19 impacted the mental health of college students? So you can look to previous research to say, well, when people are isolated, it impacts their mental health and things like that. You want to note the implications or the applications of your findings. So going beyond just what did you find, but what does this imply, or how can these findings be applied to maybe an intervention or prevention strategy? Then we also want to identify unanswered questions for future research, right? So when you're looking for the gap that you're going to fill with your thesis or your dissertation, you're probably reading a lot of papers. And if you're lucky, you'll get to some papers and they say, future research should look at this. Like we took the ball this far, this is what we found, but then the next study should look at this, right? There's the gap in the knowledge, there's a gap in the research that someone needs to fill. So you want to identify that. In your discussion section, you want to include a strengths and limitations section. When you're thinking about your strengths, you don't want to be shy about your strengths. Talk about, what were the strengths of your study? Maybe you had a better experimental technique. Maybe you had a bigger sample than some studies in the past. Maybe you did a longer follow-up than studies that have been done in the past. Talk about those things. It's important. But you also want to be honest about the limitations of your study. Because if you're not honest, someone else is going to point those out to you, whether it be a reviewer, your committee chair. You don't want those things pointed out when you're like defending, right, your dissertation or your thesis. So you want to identify the limitations. So did you have selection bias, report bias? What were some of the limitations? And discuss the impacts of the limitations on your conclusions, right? Maybe you can only generalize your results to a certain group of people, right? Because you were limited in the people who you sampled for your study, something like that. You want to, in the discussion, tell the reader the significance of your finding. In your conclusion paragraph, you want to tell them, what was the so what of your paper? Why is it important, right? You want to end your paper with a bang rather than a whimper, right? You want to be like, okay, and thank you for reading, goodbye, I'm over, right? No, like, hey, this was the importance. This is the so what of this paper. However, you don't want to overreach, right? You don't want to say something that can't be supported by your data. You don't want to say, oh, well, this intervention is a cure for cancer. It's like, probably not, right? You can only conclude what can be supported by your results. The conclusion section of your paper, you don't have to reach some cosmic conclusion, right? It's likely that you will only illuminate a small area of a phenomenon or a research topic. You'll illuminate a little bit, another research a little bit more, another researcher a little bit more. And over time, then we can see the full picture. But you don't have to come to that cosmic conclusion all on your own in your paper. And then again, at the end, add recommendations for future research studies. I know we're getting close on time. I have about 6 minutes here. I think another part of a thesis, dissertation, a scholarly article that people really struggle with is writing a title. How do you write a good title for your scholarly paper? Well, usually a good title has as few words possible that reflect the content of the paper. You want to be concise. You don't want to be too short or too long. Typically, a good title is about 12 to 13 words. In order to get a title down to 12 to 13 words, we want to eliminate unnecessary words like a study about, an investigation of. This was an investigation of whatever. Now you can just start with the whatever. You don't have to say the investigation of. Know that your title will be indexed. So our thesis and dissertations are indexed in ProQuest. Scholarly articles are indexed to a lot of different places, right? It might be read by thousands of people, and you don't have to be clever, but you do need to say what were the important, what is your study about, right? So again, the title is used for indexing, like Scopus or Medline. You want to use words that highlight the significant content of your paper or the purpose of your study. It's better to be specific rather than general. So it would be better to have a title that's about the action of streptomycin on Mycobacterium tuberculosis than to have the title being the action of antibiotics on bacteria. What antibiotic, what bacteria are we talking about? So something that I do with my students in technical writing, I do whenever I'm writing a paper, I do with my students that I'm mentoring for their thesis or dissertation. I have this steps to writing an effective title. I'm happy to share these slides through the graduate college if you would like these. But you want to ask yourself these questions and write down the answer to these questions. So what was my paper about? What techniques or designs were used? Who or what did I study, and what were the results? So you write out the answers to these 4 questions. And then you look at the answers to those questions and you pick out keywords and you list the keywords. Then step number 3, from the keywords that you've written out, you write out a sentence. And then after you've written out the sentence, then you go in and you delete all the unnecessary words, like a study of, an investigation of, any repetitive words, and you keep revising until you get that title down to about 12 or 13 words. I'd like to conclude with just talking about a few of the resources on campus. So here at UNLV, we have the Writing Center. The Writing Center offers workshops. You can schedule consultations. You can go in and learn, have someone work with you on your paper. You can take a workshop to learn how to do certain parts of a paper. Our UNLV library is a great source of resources. We have librarians. You have a librarian specific to your area. So like here, health sciences, we have a specific health sciences librarian, and she has just a wealth of knowledge. The librarians will put on workshops. So if you're struggling with maybe how to do citations or something like that, they have workshops to help you learn how to do all of that information. They have books available for resources like the scientific writing book that I use in my class and that I showed you at the beginning of this workshop. There are also writing classes on campus. So again, I told you I teach a technical and scientific writing class. That's EOH 709. I know that other schools and colleges have writing classes. So you might want to look into your program and see if there's a scientific or technical writing class within your unit. And then, of course, our UNLV Graduate College putting on workshops like this. They're a great resource for information. And you also, as you are beginning to write your thesis or a dissertation, you want to go to the Graduate College website and look at their formatting, their links, and they tell you exactly how you need to format your thesis, how you need to format your dissertation. I tell my students, before you even start writing your thesis or dissertation, before you even begin, go look at the formatting guidelines and format your prospectus, your entire thing from the very beginning to be compliant with the grad college formatting guidelines, so that in the end, you're not having to frantically go back and try to revise the formatting for your this thesis or this dissertation that you've worked so hard on. The last thing you want to do is, after it's all over and defended, have to go back and edit and revise it to meet the formatting guidelines. So Graduate College is a great source of information as well. And with that, I would like to thank you. We probably felt like you were drinking from a fire hose there. Again, I'm happy to entertain questions. I would be happy to come back and do this in a 4-part series and slow it down a little bit. But yeah, please, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer those at this time. So I think I see a question just to confirm. Did you say you should format? Yes, you should. Again, go to the grad college, look up those guidelines, and just go ahead and format it the way that it needs to be formatted. That way you don't have to go back and redo the whole thing, reformat. You don't want to have to do that. So so for your thesis or your dissertation, the referencing needs to be whatever your school or college says that the referencing needs to be. For example, here in the School of Public Health, we use APA formatting. So I'd hate for my student to write their thesis or dissertation, maybe using American Medical Association referencing, and then have to go back and change it to APA formatting, right? That would be the worst thing to have to do. So yeah, go and look at those guidelines and make sure that you're following those, just even from the very beginning.
Looks like someone has their hand raised. Feel free to unmute and ask your question.
That was me. I'm at the point of, hello everyone, writing for the IRB process. But I just do everything you just said, like in a pretense sort of way in writing it.
Yeah, so for your IRB, they're going to want to know, they're going to be a little bit more methods heavy in the IRB. So they're going to want to know, especially if you're doing it because you're dealing with human beings, right? So who are you going to be? Who are going to be your participants? How are you going to recruit them? Do you have inclusion and exclusion criteria? You're excluding certain groups of people for certain reasons, right? They are going to want to see like your survey or the questions that you're going to be asking people. They're going to want to know, everything that you're going to be doing with the human subjects in your study. So it's a lot more methods focused, but you would want to start your IRB with an importance. Like, why is your study important, right? Why would we be asking people to spend time answering a survey or spend time, doing whatever you're going to be asking them to do? So you do need to set it within the context of the important, but it's much more methods focused for the IRB. Great question.
Thank you.
Yeah. So it looks like the grad Academy is also hosting a writing boot camp this weekend. That's awesome. Though any of those sort of things that you can get involved in, practice your writing, practice anything that you can before you actually have to do it for real, right? I again always encourage my students to the GPSA and to present at the spring forum if you can. It's much better present in front of a friendly group of fellow students than, you know, the first time you're presenting is for your defense and like you're nervous and you know, just any practice you can get, practice makes perfect. And so any of those sort of things are great to be involved in.
All right. Well, if there is no other further questions, thank you so much, Dr. Pharr, for your time. Before we end today's session, I'd like all of us to thank our presenter for sharing her time and expertise with us today, and thank all of our participants for joining us today. Thank you. Before you all log off, please take a few minutes to fill out this workshop feedback survey that I'm dropping in the chat right now. It definitely does help us out and helps us improve the workshops that we provide you. So please take a few moments to fill that out, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much again, Dr. Pharr.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.